Good afternoon and welcome to another Reformed Church Center program. I'm James Brum. I direct the Reformed Church Center. We are beginning now our second academic year of these colloquies looking at understanding theological education in the RCA. And we are privileged this time to begin this season by looking at the history of our two seminaries. Let me tell you a little bit about how the day will go. After the introductory stuff is done, John will talk about the history of New Brunswick Seminary and how it relates to the history of the RCA. And then Dennis will respond for a little bit, and then we will open up the floor for questions. Now, on November 3rd, you can all come back, and Dennis will be the leader talking about the history of Western Seminary, and John will respond, and then we'll again have questions and discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce both of our speakers for today. John Coakley, of course, is L. Russell Feakes Memorial Professor of Church History Emeritus here at New Brunswick Seminary and a General Synod Professor Emeritus of the RCA. He's a widely published author of medieval and American Christianity with degrees from Wesleyan, Rutgers, and Harvard universities. The author of multiple articles and essays and book reviews, and the editor or author of 6 books, including New Brunswick Theological Seminary, An Illustrated History, 1784 to 2014. And an upcoming book, a biography of John Henry Livingston that we all look forward to seeing very soon, especially now that John is allowed into libraries again with all the rest of us who were sequestered from COVID. And that we look forward to that coming soon. Dennis Voskuil is President Emeritus of Western Seminary and a Senior Research Fellow of the Van Raalte Institute of Hope College in Holland. He has pastored several congregations in Michigan and Massachusetts, served as professor of religion at Hope, was president of Western, and then after he retired, decided that a fun thing to do in retirement would be to save a college. So served as interim president at Hope College and now has gone back to working at the Van Raalte Institute. I've visited the Van Raalte Institute, and the Van Raalte Institute, I have to say, as a church historian, is one of the few things I envy about Holland. You can be a retired church historian and go in and work for a couple hours and then have coffee and then go to lunch and then come back if you want and work for a couple hours. And you have an office and office support and all those great things while doing your historical research. We really need one of those in New Brunswick. We've got time. I've got a number of years before I retire, but anybody who's got a large amount of money and wants to start one, let me know. So John will begin and then Dennis will respond. John.
Thanks, James. And thanks to everybody for being here. I saw some of the names on the screen and they're familiar names, but it's lovely to think you're there. And welcome to everyone. I'm going to attempt here a brief narrative of the history of New Brunswick Seminary. I'll try to touch on the high points, but so that this isn't just a list of events, I'll keep in mind an overarching question, a broad one to be sure, but I hope it will provide a bit of focus. It's the question of identity. What has it meant over time to be New Brunswick Seminary? And that is a broad question, but to make it a bit more precise, I find it helpful to think about to think specifically about the changing relation of the seminary to the Reformed Church. Okay, then, to begin, New Brunswick Seminary claims 1784 as the date of its founding. This was when the Synod of the Reformed Church in America, then called the Reformed Protestant Dutch Church in America, elected a learned New York minister, John Henry Livingston, to be the first person to serve as its, quote, professor, unquote, giving him the responsibility of teaching all the students who were preparing for ministry in the church. He was to do this for more than 2 decades in New York City, during which time he remained a pastor. Then he moved to New Brunswick in 1810 to become president of Queen's College, later to be called Rutgers, bringing his students with him. 2 years later, in 1812, the Synod officially organized the seminary we call now New Brunswick Seminary. But it was, at first, the closest thing it had to a name was that it was the Theological Institution of Queen's College. It had a board of superintendents, a set of rules, and a faculty consisting of John Henry Livingston. So, properly speaking, the school was formed in 1812. But we remember 1784, the date of Livingston's election as professor, as the founding date, because his election, in an important sense, determined the school's identity. Here's what I mean. The Reformed Protestant Dutch Church in America was born, for all intents and purposes, just before the Revolutionary War in 1772, when the Dutch congregations in New York and New Jersey became independent of the Reformed Church in the Netherlands, to which they had been subordinate for more than a century. The Reformed Church in the Netherlands had been reluctant to let them go their own way and had delayed the matter for years. The main reason for its reluctance was that the church, or a principal reason for its reluctance, was that the church in the Netherlands, which placed a very high value on a learned ministry, was an established national church, had a distinctive system whereby it depended on Reformed ministers in the national Dutch universities to prepare students for ordination. But there were no similar Dutch institutions in America to do this. And that was a major reason why they held back from approving the American church's independence. When they did finally give their approval, it was on the explicit understanding that the American Dutch churches would appoint a professor of their own and hold that professor accountable to prepare the students for the ministry, in effect establishing something like the Dutch system of education for ministry, indeed even a bit more closely tied to the church than the Dutch one. The American churches agreed to this and put it into their constitution in 1772. They were ready to elect Livingston already by 1775 on the eve of the Revolutionary War. But the war intervened, during which the Synod met only sporadically and without a full quorum. And so it was after the war, in 1784, that Livingston was finally given the post. But my point here is that it was only on his election, in a certain sense, that the independence of the new American church was complete. So the church wouldn't have been the church without the professor. And the fact of the office of professor, for it was an office, as we sometimes say, the fourth office, for the fact of the office of the professor meant that the founders of the RCA construed theological education as, and I'm going to use this word several times, as organic to the church. That is, the professor held one of the offices of the church, just as did the minister of the word or the elder or the deacon. And that meant that the seminary, when it came into being, wasn't a program sponsored by the church or an institution affiliated with the church. Instead, it was rooted in the office of professor, and as such was of the being or the essence of the church, as much as was the office of minister of word or elder or deacon. The school's form of governance in these early years stands as a sign of that organic connection between the seminary and the church. This form of governance relied on a board of superintendents created by the General Synod in 1812, along with the organization of the seminary. The title was apt. These superintendents really did superintend the seminary. That is, they were not like the modern board of trustees to which the president and other administrators report, and who sort of oversees the self-contained action of the school. At that time, there was no president or dean or administrative organization to give the seminary its own structure and self-direction. Instead, the superintendents themselves, as designated senior ministers of the church, ran the seminary directly on the church's behalf, overseeing the curriculum and the discipline of the students and the finances and all the details of the life of the school. And not incidentally, when vacancies occurred in the professorate, they were filled more often than not by ministers who had served as superintendents. And all of this was true pretty much through the 19th century and actually into the early 20th century. Read the superintendent's minutes and you not only get a complete report of what was happening, but you witnessed there the decisions at every level that determined what was happening. These ministers of the church conducted the work of the seminary as part of the broader work of the church, indeed initiating the young seminary students into their own brotherhood, as it was, of ministers at the church's heart. Another indication of what I'm calling this organic connection of the school with the church, or to put it another way, that the very identity of the school is wrapped up in the identity of the church, is that the seminary doesn't have a name well into the 20th century. In the General Synod minutes, it is simply our seminary, or later, after the founding of Western Seminary, it's specified as the seminary at New Brunswick, the one there. And for a long time, it appears in the General Synod agenda under the heading, the professorate, that is, its authority is conceived in terms of the church office that it gives expression to. So what it meant to be New Brunswick Seminary in those early years, and in fact for a long time after those early years, was to be a core expression, an organic element of a particular church, the RCA. The organic model then remains the norm for the relation between the seminary and the Reformed Church through the 19th century. It was still in place, that is, in the last half of the 19th century, which is roughly the period that Howard Hageman called the seminary's golden age. Now, however, we begin to see it have its own institutional identity as well. Up until that time, or more precisely up until 1856, NBTS had been closely tied to Rutgers College, which itself was an institution connected with the Reformed Dutch Church. The two schools had shared a classroom building, Old Queen's, which is still standing on the Rutgers campus, as many of you will know. But in 1856, the Reformed Dutch Church began to build a new campus for the seminary to occupy the whole block between George Street and College Avenue on the east and west, and Bishop Avenue and Seminary Place on the north and south. I apologize to those of you who can't visualize that, that I don't have the picture. It was too complicated to put it up. But that's basically the same area as has been the seminary's territory right up until just a few years ago. Over a 30-year period from 1856 to the mid-1880s, an impressive row of buildings went up facing Seminary Place, including 4 large faculty residences, 2 on each end of the campus, a large central building that included housing, classrooms, and chapel called Herzog Hall, and on either side of it, 2 matching buildings, the Sage Library, which is the only one of all of those buildings still standing. On one side of Herzog Hall it was, and on the other side of Herzog Hall, its twin, Saddam Hall, a building that included classrooms and a gym. In the meantime, the so-called covenant that yoked the seminary with Rutgers College, came to an end. Officially this happened in 1867, as Rutgers was in the early stages of its gradual transformation from being a church-sponsored college to being a state university. The seminary attracted donors at that time, most famously Gardner Sage, for whom the library is named, and James Saddam, for whom that other building I mentioned was named, and whose statue you can see now in its new place on the south lawn of the library. This was also the period when the first African-American students came to the seminary, Ile Walden and John Bergen, both of the class of 1879. And although the school has produced missionaries throughout its history, it was this period of the late 19th century that saw the graduations of some of its most famous ones, including Horace Underwood, who after his graduation in 1884 became a pioneer missionary in Korea, and Samuel Zwemer and James Cantine, who founded the important Reformed mission in the Persian Gulf in the 1890s, which has continued to this day. And it was in that period of the late 19th century also that the influence of the social gospel was felt in the seminary. And one of our graduates, Graham Taylor, became closely associated with that movement as he engaged in urban ministry in Hartford and then in Chicago as a colleague of Jane Addams in developing the the community ministries that she's so famous for. NBTS was clearly, therefore, by the late 19th century, becoming an institution in its own right. Nonetheless, all the way through those growth years of the late 19th century, the superintendents still governed the school directly on behalf of the synod. There was still no president or dean. The faculty still came directly from the parish clergy, and the synod directly controlled the finances. An important clue as to what hadn't, in fact, changed was the fact that by the mid-19th century, already the Reformed Church had begun to organize its other work by delegating it to dependent boards. The Board of Foreign Missions, the Board of Education, the Board of Publication, and there were others. This was a phenomenon of the mid-19th century, and it was a practical move that enabled the Synod to sponsor and supervise the work of the church, but to delegate those tasks to dependent boards, each of which had its own executive, and though it was accountable to the Synod, had its own agenda and modus operandi. These were dependent structures. These were instruments of the church, instruments or means to accomplish the church's mission, rather than constituent elements of the church itself. But significantly, the seminaries, Western Seminary, by the way, about which we'll hear from Dennis, was established in precisely this late 19th century period. The seminaries were not, for the meantime anyway, conceived as instruments of mission in that sense. Rather, they still had the character of a constituent element, an organic connection to the constituted office of professor, which had been at the heart of the church since the beginning. This is one of those changes that didn't happen because everyone assumed this organic connection, that a seminary was not analogous to a board. But this changed. And in the early 20th century, the seminary's relationship to the Reformed Church went gradually, but fairly quickly, from being organic to what I would call being instrumental. That is, theological education became one of the church's programs, doing one of the jobs with a role analogous to that of the boards, an instrument or tool of the church for a particular purpose, rather than a constituent organic element of the church. I say this happened gradually, and it did, but there is a crucial date, and that date is 1923. For it was in 1923 that the General Synod adopted a new plan for New Brunswick Seminary, and for Western too, though again, I'll leave that to Dennis, because I think it has a slightly different set of significances for Western. The immediate background of that action was a decline in enrollment at New Brunswick and a perception that the curriculum was out of date, a perception that actually has a lot to do with changing theological atmosphere in the early 20th century, and that a kind of insistence, which was felt strongly, especially in the eastern part of the church, that the modern world was leaving traditional Christianity behind, and we needed to adjust ourselves. The main new feature was to be the office of president, which had not existed before, and a new streamlined board of managers, chaired by the president, which would take over most of the responsibilities of governance from the superintendents. The president and the managers would have the responsibility of articulating a vision for the school, as we would now put it, and overseeing its operations. The old model of direct oversight through a hands-on board of senior ministers pretty much faded away, and the seminary became a self-directing corporate entity, which was responsible to plead its own cause. The church was no longer assuming the existence of the seminary as simply a given element in its own existence on the organic model. Rather, it was stepping back and asking a new question: how shall we best do theological education in the RCA? And once the Synod asks that question, it has ceased to think of the seminary as a component of itself. Rather, it has begun to regard the seminary as a means to an end, an instrument or tool for the education of clergy, which is analogous to the other ends it might have, various ends of mission, and which it could achieve theoretically in some other way. In other words, the model of the relation of church to seminary went from being organic to being instrumental. This had huge implications for both the seminary and the church. As for what it meant for the seminary, in the years ahead, the seminary acquired a new sense of self-direction and focus. Within a year of the adoption of the 1923 plan, the Reverend William H.S. Demarest, who had recently retired from the presidency of Rutgers, became the first president of the seminary. And within a few years, he centralized and rationalized the seminary's program. For instance, he brought in new teachers, like the theologian Edward Strong Worcester, who communicated a strong sense of the contemporary relevance of the Christian faith, a controversial sense of it. And he also Demarest also carefully crafted his annual reports to the Synod to project the image of a stable, viable, well-directed institution that proved the wisdom of the Synod's plan of 1923. So by separating the seminary out from the body of the church, reconceptualizing it from organ to instrument, the Synod had allowed the seminary its own space and breathing room as a self-directing institution. But by the mid-1960s, some other implications of that shift came to the fore, as the underlying instrumental question the Synod had asked in 1923 once more became explicit. Are our seminaries the best way for us to do theological education? Are they the best tool for that end? It's interesting to note that as this wasn't a time of that this was not a time of decline in the seminary's life, unlike the early 20s, but partly because of the very vitality of the seminary and of the RCA in the 1960s, a sort of restlessness emerged, a dissatisfaction with the status quo, and an acute awareness of the church's calling in a changing world. And it was in that context that the RCA began to consider the possibility of merger of the denomination's two seminaries, that is, New Brunswick and Western. In 1967, they combined the boards of the two seminaries, and though they did not merge in a single location, but that was extensively discussed, the curricula of the two was combined in a so-called bi-level multi-site program, whereby students spent roughly the first half of their MDiv career at New Brunswick and the second half at Western, and pursued a very innovative and visionary program that engaged students with the contexts in which they would minister and focused on their professional formation as persons. So for a while, after the advent of the joint board and the beginning of the heady new experiment, New Brunswick Seminary putatively went out of business as a separate self-directing institution. The RCA had put down the old tool and it was attempting to fashion a very new one. The experiment, however, didn't last long. The bi-level multi-site program, though popular to this day among the students and faculty who were part of it, was discontinued for a number of reasons in 1974. And the last student graduated from it in 1977. And then, though officially the joint board continued in existence for another decade and a half, in effect, the situation of two separate RCA seminaries had returned, and New Brunswick was on its own again by the mid-70s. But by then, by the mid-70s, much had changed again, both for the RCA and for New Brunswick Seminary. As to the RCA, the question whether denominational seminaries were the best way for the denomination to do theological education did not go away. I mean, that question that had spurred the bi-level multi-site experiment did not go away. And most portentously, in 1984, the General Synod established what has come to be called the Ministerial Formation Coordinating Agency, the MFCA, to sponsor and supervise RCA students who wish to go to other seminaries besides the two RCA seminaries, and really takes care of their preparation, including their evaluation and their preparation for their classes exams, just as the two denominational seminaries had done in the past. The invention of, and what this did was effectively allowed anyone in the RCA to prepare for RCA ministry at an accredited seminary of their choice. The invention of the MFCA, I'm suggesting, marked the full fruition of the conceptual move of theological education from organic to instrumental. And with the MFCA as a comprehensive instrument now for ensuring that persons are prepared for the church's ministry through theological education, NBTS was by the 1980s no longer strictly necessary from the Reformed Church's point of view. Now, that's not to say that it still didn't have an important life in the RCA, as it does indeed to this day. But the move from organ to instrument had happened with those implications that I've suggested. As for New Brunswick Seminary itself, the handwriting was on the wall by the end of the bi-level multi-site experiment that it could no longer function solely as a viable denominational institution, as it had been doing since the mid-century decades. But there was great opportunity opening up as well at that point. And in 1975, under the leadership of President Howard Hageman, and in part, I think, as a legacy, whether acknowledged at the time or not, of the bi-level multi-site program's emphasis on the social reality of our urban context, NBTS opened its doors to a more diverse student body, extending beyond the Reformed Church, at first through what was called the evening program, but which by the early 1980s had evolved into a new concept of the whole life of the school, whereby a wide spectrum of students from a variety of church backgrounds and ethnic and racial backgrounds were able to receive a theological education, many of them on a part-time basis and at two sites, one in New Brunswick and one in Queens. This expansion and diversification of the student body has had huge implications for the whole identity of New Brunswick Seminary. In terms of race, ethnicity, and denominational background, it has led to a shift in the makeup of the faculty, administration, and staff, as well as the student body. And beginning in 2006, it underlay an institutional commitment of NBTS to be an anti-racist institution with implications for every aspect of the seminary's life from that point until the present. One of those implications was another change in New Brunswick Seminary's official relation to the Reformed Church. In 2010, we adopted a new mission statement, which President Greg Mast took leadership in composing and which was agreed to by the General Synod, a statement that no longer says that NBTS is, quote, an institution, or I think the way it used to read was a teaching institution of the Reformed Church, but rather speaks of the RCA and NBTS now as partners, which means that not only do we no longer have an organic identity with the RCA, but we also don't have an instrumental connection any longer, or at least we're not defined anymore as one of the RCA's instruments, even though in some respects we can still function that way and do. But now we're defined as a partner to the RCA, and that's a different metaphor altogether, which if I had time, I would unpack a little bit more, but I think it will be obvious to you that implies two discrete actors interacting, which is a rather different way of thinking than either of those other two metaphors I've used. So that's my story. We've seen an arc in the meaning of NBTS over time as it moved in its relationship with the Reformed Church, from being organic to that church to being instrumental to it. And then finally, in these recent years, to being a partner with it. But before I quit, and I think I'm just about out of time, I want to add a brief coda. It's also true that, like many other things in the history of churches, the memory and effect of past movements, past identities, past structures lives on in sometimes meaningful ways in the present. And in the very notion of partnership, I think there may be some new room for some echoes of that old sense of organic connection with the Reformed Church, which I think I'm seeing in President McCreary's ministry here and his helpful presence within the denomination. That's anyway a subject for conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now we'll welcome Dennis, who's going to have a little bit of a response.
First, I want to thank John for his presentation and maybe promote his book on the history of New Brunswick, which I found very helpful when I first read it, and then when I read it again this week. And for the paper's attempt to provide interpretive categories. organic relationship with the church, instrumental relationship with the church, and now as a partner with the church. And these terms of relationship kind of provide a thread through the entire presentation. So first of all, gratitude for that. Second, some of the things I want to say have to do with the. I'll speak more about some of these issues when we deal with the Western Seminary, but there is an intersection when the Western Seminary came on the scene with New Brunswick and with the Western communities, the RCA people in the West. So some of those I will want to touch upon. So just one comment about the categories, at least the categories of organic and instrumental. It seems to me as I began to think through these, John, that in some respects, as you say at the end, organic relationship is still there. There is that organic connection that you identified at the very end of your presentation. And at the beginning, I think even though it was the Synod that did it, there was an instrumental relationship, even in hiring or promoting Livingston to be the professor of theology. So I can't sharply divide these, and you didn't try to do that. I'm not trying to put that on you, but it made me think that these have continued through the years. And of course, New Brunswick has many more years to consider than Western Seminary does. And these categories also do fit in a sense, Western Seminary. I want to ask, do you think that the organic connection could have lasted in a fulsome way longer than it did? Was it possible with a more complex culture and a more complex church, which is growing and moving west, for this organic relationship to have continued, perhaps even up until 1923? And I looked over the recommendations of this committee on the conditions of the seminaries, which, by the way, did really point out the need of New Brunswick more than Western at that time. It specifically states that could that organic connection have been more fulsome and lasted longer than 1923 officially, or whenever you want to talk about the dwindling of that relationship? I just want to ask that question, and I'll get some of these out, and then I'll just turn it over back to you, and then we'll leave it open to everybody. So what impact did Western Seminary have, the establishment of Western, have on New Brunswick? You don't really deal with that, and I will, but I do want to say that there were, between the years that Hope College existed and Western Seminary came about, that there were Western students from the West that came to New Brunswick and were very satisfied basically with the education they received at New Brunswick. As a matter of fact, I think compared Western's early years rather unfavorably with the training that they received at New Brunswick. They understood that they were getting an inferior product at Western early on. But there were some real loyal folks that had been trained at New Brunswick that came back to the West and spoke up in opposition to the establishment of a theological seminary in the West, believing it was unnecessary. And they were in a minority, and increasingly so as you get into the troubles of the Masonic Lodge controversy and other financial issues and so forth. So I just want to say that there was a connection in one way or another. And you can get quotes from the East at this time that say, why are we giving in to the Western people who want this seminary? Why are we worrying about it? And then when the Western Seminary, which didn't have a real name, of course, except the Theological School of Hope College, when this school was closed because supposedly of financial conditions or whatever, there were people who spoke out in favor of it, but most of them in the West were upset. And eventually the pressure was too great for the Synod to not reestablish the seminary in 1884 and 85. But anyway, that whole connection I will look at in my presentation. And could Western and New Brunswick have cooperated more fully and taken advantage we talk about the efforts in the 60s and 70s to bring the seminaries together, including the establishment of a single board, which lasted all the way up almost until 1994 when I became the president of the seminary. The single board and the effort for the bi-level multi-site program. And it seemed from my reading of responses to that program and having two seminaries, which was a result of the churches not wanting to give up their seminary, the East and the West. But the bi-level multi-site program it resulted in a non-favorable view, especially on the part of the faculties of both Western and Brunswick, did not want to lose their own distinctive identity. And so therefore, this little denomination still has had two seminaries with a different relationship, of course, as you talk about the instrumental and then the partnership. But I was interested in that. And what was the real reason for the opposition to the bi-level multi-site philosophically? And finally, I'll just ask this question about the future relationship of New Brunswick to the RCA as you see it. You talk about the partnership. Will that partnership continue, or will it diminish? Will it grow? I'm very interested in that. So a lot of stuff I threw out at you, and a lot of it's connected to the Western Seminary and the Western Church, but I'm just interested in your response to those observations. I've got to.
Oh, thanks very much, Dennis. So I think I took most of those questions. All really quite germane, I think. Thank you. I think it's, first of all, on the question of whether there wasn't always an instrumental aspect. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're talking. I think I'm trying to talk anyway at this point, sort of more in terms of paradigms, where how ideas group themselves, and how certain ones become dominant over others, rather than whether a particular idea is present or absent. And I think maybe perhaps a more precise way of talking about it would be to think about an overall model and what its kind of guiding coherence is. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that what Livingston was elected to do was prepare people for their exams, and he was the instrument of doing that. No question about it. I think that's right. Let's see. I think it's a very interesting question whether the organic model should have survived more past 1923, and I think my own feeling is that it's been sort of inevitable and part of our broader culture for the RCA in all ways to have to act as an institution analogous to a business or objective based organization. And I confess to some nostalgia about the organic relationship, and some thought that maybe there are ways of preserving that. But I think in broadly, I think it's inevitable. I think it might, to indulge in counterfactualism, I think myself that if a presidency hadn't been established in New Brunswick in 1923, and even if that president hadn't been Demarest, I'm not sure that New Brunswick would have survived many more years. At least the feeling you get from the debates there that preceded the Synod of 1923 suggests that it was in fairly difficult position, and may well have remained so. So no, I don't think that the organic relationship can have survived as the prevailing model. But I think I also think that I'll try not to say this at great length to give other people a chance to talk, but it does seem to me, and I think it's partly when I came onto the faculty in the 80s, I was influenced by people like Paul Fries and David Wanders, and a kind of sense of recovering a clearer sense of being reformed, and I think that's quite kind of related to this notion of a more organic connection based in the offices, with a new appreciation for the offices. You asked some other questions, and I'm waiting to hear more from you about relations between East and West. I think that would have been another way of focusing, of my focusing, and I think it seems to me it's such a fascinating thing. It's the most fascinating thing about the history of the RCA itself. It seems to me that you have these two cultures that are so that are at loggerheads with each other in so many ways, and yet are so deeply intertwined in their Dutch heritage, both structurally and in terms of Dutch intellectual history. Anyway, that doesn't really answer the question, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from you about it next time.
Thank you. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. And I see a hand raised already, so I'm going to ask Steve Norden to unmute. And I think at some point we may go from this very select mode of visual to the famous Zoom Brady Bunch arrangement so that everybody can see everybody. Steve, go ahead.
John, thank you very much. And Dennis, thanks for your comments too. Boy, it's just great to be among friends. I have to add that.
Hi, Steve.
But John, I'll ask you, and then Dennis, I'll probably ask you as well when you make your presentation. John, you mentioned tangentially the creation of T, which morphed into MFCA. I'm curious whether, in your opinion, that has had an adverse impact on theological education in the RCA first, but then more generally upon the whole life and ethos of the RCA itself.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess I'll give you a personal opinion. But I also, over my years of being a general synod professor and being on the certification committee for the MFCA, for T and then MFCA, I do appreciate it and realize that it has done good work, and maybe inevitably it had to happen that way. But yeah, I think it. I guess my sense, and this is a personal view, which I think it has no more credibility than yours. Whatever you think, Steve, that it would be. But basically, looking at it from New Brunswick for all the years that I was on the faculty there, yeah, I think it really did have an effect of eroding somewhat a denominational commitment to theological education, and that something was definitely lost. I began to wish that we had some other model. Our model for how to deal with students going to different seminaries was, over all the years that I studied NBTS, there were dispensations, and everybody always grumbled about the dispensations, that they had to come from either NBTS or WTS. But that was the system, that you had to go through the denominational seminaries to get the dispensations. But other denominations have other ways of dealing with this. I mean, the Episcopalians say that, yeah, it's possible to go to a non-Episcopalian seminary, but you've got to go to general seminary for your so that you absolve some of the ethos there, and for your Anglican work. The Lutherans say something similar, that you can go other places, but you have to have a Lutheran year at a Lutheran seminary. The Methodists, as we learned the hard way at NBTS, have a system whereby they accredit other denominations for purposes of having Methodist students, but exercise some control over what that means. I mean, those would be other models, and I have often kind of wished that we had gone with another model.
Thank you.
I'm actually interested to know what Dennis might say about that.
Am I muted or unmuted here? I agree with you. I think that there was a proposal at one time, or at least looking into having a seminary presence in California. I think the California churches are what drove this thing, and that didn't prevail. And they kind of used Fuller as the Western Seminary, or the far Western Seminary. But I think you're right. I just want to add that I think for us in the Midwest and the far West, the commission pastor program has done more to erode the influence of the seminaries than the MFCA, because there are classes where there are very few trained and ordained ministers of word and sacrament in some parts of the farther West, and that troubles me. I think that I approved it. I was at the Synod where it happened, but now I look back and realize that was a major thing, because fewer and fewer pastors in the church are getting what I consider to be a tradition of the Reformed tradition, highly educated, or at least as well as possible, realizing that charisma is important. It's not just book learning, and it's never been just book learning at Western or New Brunswick, but still, I think that was a troubling decision that we made.
Thank you both. This is a case of confirmation bias, but nevertheless, I really appreciate both your perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Anybody else? I don't see any little electronic hands, and I can't necessarily see your other hands. But Dr. McCreary is popping into the chat, so I'm going to make him pop into the real world here and invite him to unmute and just ask his question out loud.
That wasn't a question. Just making a statement that I highly value the language and the notion of New Brunswick Theological Seminary being an organic partner. And I put those words together from Dr. Coakley, that in a sense, it's organic in that we're an integral part. I look at like the CFM, for example, that was part of the reason that Livingston was actually called to be professor of the Reformed Church in America. And so how could New Brunswick not be engaged in that many years later? And so that organicity for me is engaged in that, involved in that when you say it that way. But we also are a partner, and the way we're partnering with grant projects and other things plays out that way as well. So I love it. We're looking at revising the Constitution, and I think those words will become pivotal there. And so Dr. Coakley, get ready to be ciphered back in, or somehow pulled back into that conversation with the board. Help me with that as well, and so I appreciate that.
Like I know you've been interested in the office of professor, and I think in lots of ways that the nature of the office was kind of key to the model of the organic model.
Yes.
And I was on the committee. Jim Brownson and I were both on the committee, and Al Jansen were on the committee in 2008. I think that formulated that suggested the changes in the Book of Church Order that were approved, I think, in 2011. And as I think back to that experience, which was a very stimulating time to think through that one of the things we were trying to do was I didn't have the language for it then, but was to sort of recover, in recovering the significance of the office, also recovering the sense of an organic notion of theological education.
Yeah, I'll actually, the board has recommended that I am given to the office of the General Synod professor at the next General Synod meeting. So we'll see what happens with that. But I don't assume too much. I just kind of wait and see. But that should be a part of it. But thank you all both. Thank you both for this. This has been very exciting and awesome. I'm loving it.
Thanks.
Okay, does anybody else want to raise a hand? I know we're close to 1 o'clock, but we've gone past the time limits before. So
can I there's one message in the chat too, Pastor Brom. Yeah. The thing that people don't recognize is that New Brunswick, however, since 2017, we only had 6 RCA students. Now we have 32 RCA students enrolled at New Brunswick, which is a 500% increase. In addition to that, that diversity is still there in those persons who have come. And it's the second highest percentage of students at New Brunswick. And so people keep thinking that we have all these other denominations. Yes, we do. But we've also now, again, re-engaged with the denomination to where our RCA student body is also growing.
Yes, indeed.
Pastor Brum, may I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
This is F.W. Hood. Hi, Dr. Coakley.
Hi.
Nice to see you. As a current New Brunswick student, have done my master's, now doing my doctorate there. Even though I am not RCA in organism, I am RCA as theologically trained. What is it that we can do for those of us who are not RCA to take the legacy and the life of RCA into the places that we're going now in order to minister?
That's a great question, and I think I saw also that L.L. Debril had said something like that in the comments. I think from my experience in teaching at New Brunswick in the years that I taught there, I mean that I think is a very compelling question. I mean, because in so many ways, what we've tried to do in those years was not be colonial, not to colonize non-RCA students into the RCA. I think people like Virginia Wiles helped us, kept us honest, or tried to, or around issues like that. And when I was director of the center, I had James's job. There were real questions about whether those were the early years of the center, and there were real questions, which I think James has dealt with more successfully than I did. Questions as to whether what we were doing was privileging a group of students, family or RCA students, among a community of students in the school, which was much larger than the RCA. But to turn that around, FW, as I appreciate that you're doing, that to say how can we at the same time give full appreciation and support and acknowledgement of the presence of other traditions among us? How can we say, okay, but we also offer our tradition, offer this tradition that's historically part of the seminary as a gift that can be received? It doesn't resolve the question, but it suggests a way to think about it. And it seems to me the center, the way that James has been working with it, has been indeed a great experiment in doing just that.
I think it's also helpful for us to remember that while we have been, as a school at New Brunswick, more intentionally ecumenical since the 1970s and 80s. You go back in the history of New Brunswick, and it's amazing the number of times we have people from other denominations well back into the even early 19th century studying at New Brunswick and getting their degrees here. I mean, we never closed the doors to anybody else. I've often jokingly said that ever since the British took over New Amsterdam, the Dutch Reformed have lived by that good philosophy of everybody else's money is just as good as Dutch money, and we'll take it. And so we've welcomed all sorts of other students in that spirit, but now it's a more intentional thing and a way that I believe has enriched and strengthened our lives. And of course, in the Reformed Church Center, we often talk about the fact that the RCA is not the only Reformed church. And so mostly as an excuse for when we want to do a broader program, everybody can, there are lots of churches that consider themselves Reformed. And of course, if we take scripture seriously, God is reforming all of us all the time. So we'll accept those Reformed AME folks at our Reformed Church Center gatherings and all those other Reformed folks as we're all being reformed constantly. Any other questions, comments?
I mentioned people who were with me on the commission that suggested the changes in the BCO about the professorate. But another person who was on that committee was Steve Norden, and I apologize to him. I'm not the only person in this conversation that represents that discussion.
Oh, I am sure that Steve forgives you, and I know he's hearing you now. So this is good.
Good. Yeah.
Since I'm seeing no more hands and we are just past 1:00, I will say good afternoon to everybody. We look forward to November 3rd, which is when Dennis will talk about Western's side of this history, and John will respond, and we'll have more conversation. In the interim, General Synod is going to happen, and there are all sorts of things dealing with theological education at General Synod that should give Dennis a chance to be constantly changing his paper as he watches the live stream. And we wish him luck with that. Everyone else, I hope to see you again here in November and at other Reformed Church Center programs. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon.
Thanks.